Hello, Scouted Football Podcast fans. Welcome back. A bit of a change of pace to begin this week's episode. For those of us living in the UK, it's been hard to escape one particular news story in the past week or so surrounding the topic of male violence against women. It's an issue that's universal. It affects every one of us because each of us know a woman who's felt unsafe walking alone. The fact that 97% of young women in the United Kingdom have faced sexual harassment is as shocking as it is concerning. Given that this is a podcast with a predominantly male listenership, I think it's important that we as men take it upon ourselves to positively change our own behaviour so that women no longer have to alter theirs in fear of being approached, made to feel uncomfortable, unsafe, and even attacked. Whether it's crossing to the other side of the road if you're walking behind somebody, or calling out problematic behaviour among friends, or jokes in bad taste, that sort of thing can make all the difference. This is a real issue, but one we were all capable of doing something about. Thank you. Hello, you're listening to the Scouted Football Podcast with myself, Joe Donoghue. Today I'm delighted to be able to announce we have the return of Lee Scott, and we're going to be looking at some second tier scouting, so that is players in the second division of their respective nations. Lee, it's been a little while, but how are you doing?
Yeah, I'm good, thank you, Joe. How are you?
Yeah, not bad at all. Obviously, the under 21 Euros has kicked off, so that's going to keep my evenings busy for the next week. It's gonna make a bit of a drab international break a little bit more exciting, I think. And yeah, it's something to fill the days with, I suppose.
Yeah, exactly. I've already warned my wife. I think I was relegated to watching the Holland game last night on the iPad with headphones in. So that's a compromise you kind of have to come to sometimes.
You know it's a compromise when the headphones go in. That's just it's one of those things you just have to accept, and you kind of just tuned out to the rest of the world.
Yeah.
But yeah, very much the same at my end as well. And it's interesting because there are a lot of players who currently play in the second tier of their respective nations playing at that tournament. I think Italy's team they drew 1-1 with the Czech Republic, and they had quite a few Serie B players in there. But in terms of today, we've got sort of three players each that we're going to discuss and sort of compare notes on. Lee, I was just wondering if you'd like to get us underway, or would you like? Are you feeling a bit nervous? Do you want me to go first?
It's fine. I think I'll manage to go first. I think I'll go with I've actually picked a defender and two midfielders, so I'll go for a defender first. And my defender is Bafodé Diakité, the 20-year-old French centre-back who plays in the second tier of French football for Toulouse. He's a really interesting player, somebody who I've been watching for a little while. Obviously, Toulouse were relegated last term. They're looking likely to be in the promotion charge this season. I think I'm right in saying that they're currently, I think, third in the table, although Clermont-Foot have got a game in hand on them just above them, so that the gap between third and second might stretch a little bit. Toulouse themselves are a little bit interesting because they've just been bought over. Well, not just this season, they've been bought over by the Red Bird Football Group, which has Damien Comolli as the president of football and president or head of football operations at the group. So there's a little bit of investment at the club, and Toulouse are a club who are really well known for great youth development. They always seem to have one or two players popping around the first team that have come through their youth system, and these players will go on to have good careers elsewhere, or they'll develop into really important first team players for the club. If I had to put my money on it, I would say that Diakité will be somebody who will move on somewhere else because he's got a profile, not just because, you talk about French centre-backs at the moment and they seem to be all the vogue. If you look at the under-21 squad that the French have got at this European Championship, their defensive options are staggering. And Diakité is somebody who may have to wait his turn from an international perspective a little bit, but that doesn't diminish his quality. He's not undersized. I think he's just about 6'1", but he's got quite a powerful build. He's one of these modern defenders that can play as part of a back three, or he can play as one of a back four. He's really comfortable in possession of the ball, which is obviously what everybody's looking for at the moment. And interestingly for Toulouse, he quite often plays on the left-hand side despite being right-footed. So he is comfortable when he has to make challenges or play the ball on his left-hand side, as well as being able to play the ball on the right. He's capable of stepping into midfield in possession and finding those line breaking passes. I mean, I'll be honest, when I scout centre halves, that's always something that I like to see. I like to see centre backs who are willing to take chances and play that line breaking pass that adds packing value, to use the advanced stat that's been coined by the German company. But what's really important, I think, is that he can also defend. There's been a couple of times, if you watch clips of him play or you go back and watch his games from last season, there's been a couple of times where he's made really important challenges in the defensive phase. And the way he celebrates when he makes a great clearance, it's like he scored a goal. And that's something that you really want to see from a young defender, because you want a defender who, yes, he can play on the ball, but you want them to love defending, because that's their job 70% of the time, unless you're playing in a really ridiculously possession orientated team in a Manchester City, where for the most part they're using the build up phase and progression. But for the most part, you're going to have defenders wanting to defend, and Diakite gives you that. He's really powerful, quick, intelligent footballer, and I think that he is primed for a move this summer at the age of 20. I think that it's quite likely, especially if Toulouse end up not going up, I don't think there's any chance they can hold on to him.
Yeah, that title race, or rather the promotion race in Ligue 2, is really hotting up at the moment. And there's a player that is in amongst it, that I've selected as well. But just on Diakite, yeah, it's interesting you mentioned obviously that he's a right footer in a back three, but can also play on the left, because that's one of the things that I noticed as well. Because typically he'll be on the right hand side of that back three, but on other occasions, you could see him popping up on the left hand side, and I thought, well, it's good that you can have that versatility. Often, young players actually become victims of their own versatility sometimes. But I think that is especially in his position. It's not as though he's playing left wing and right wing and central midfield. It's like he's essentially playing the same position but on both sides. So I quite like that versatility, because if there's an injury to the left-sided centre half or wherever he goes, he can be that man to step in on either side of the defence. In terms of him typically playing in this back three, do you think there's anything about his game that perhaps would be exposed a little bit if he was playing in a back four with a sort of a two-man central defence partnership, or is he, as we were saying, versatile enough to play as in a back three, but also a back two in terms of central defensive partnerships?
I think that from a tactical perspective, sometimes you've got to understand with a young player when they play as a back three, especially Diakite. I've already touched upon the fact he's quite comfortable in the ball, and he doesn't mind stepping into midfield and carrying the ball into the opposition half and trying to trigger the opposition to press him before he passes the ball on. I think in a back three, you can do that comfortably because you have good cover. I mean, the other two centre halves are there; they're able to slide over and provide good defensive cover and a good base to the attack like that. But I think when you play as part of a back four, it becomes more difficult unless the team that you're playing in are very well coached. I mean, you see the likes of Virgil van Dijk do it, you see the likes of John Stones do it, you see likes of Aymeric Laporte do it, all these people who play at the very, very top level. But when they make those movements, the rest of the team understand how they need to provide balance and cover behind. So you might see the six slide across, you might see the fullback drop deeper because the centre half's pressed up. I think that as he makes the next move, it's going to become very evident if that's something that he's going to continue to do, because it's likely his next move will be to a team at a higher level with a higher level of competition, where opposition players, if Diakite steps into midfield and loses the ball, or if his pass is loose and the opposition regain possession in transition, I think then it becomes really interesting, because you start to see whether he can adjust his game to no longer make those mistakes, because they will take advantage of any mistakes that he makes.
Diakite is one who had a pretty hard start to life as a professional footballer, in terms of being in that Toulouse defence last season,
Yeah.
that being 2019-20, that just lost so many consecutive games in Liga that season. That was very much a year in which it was a very inexperienced defence. It was hemorrhaging goals, and before the season was curtailed due to COVID, the team were on a one way ticket to Ligue 2. It's obviously good to see that they've bounced back. They're in within the race to come back up. But in terms of on a personal level, Dikite is obviously he's stuck around. He hasn't sort of jumped ship at all. He's now sort of an integral part of this promotion challenging squad. Are there any improvements that you've seen in his game from sort of season 1 to season 2? And would you say that, because often when you drop down a division, obviously the quality isn't the same. Would you say that any of these improvements that you've seen are to do with the level of quality that he's facing, or rather that he's just getting more exposure, more first team experience?
I think you could argue it's a little bit of everything, but for a young player to suffer a relegation in his first season in the first team is difficult, especially a young player who played quite a few minutes in that relegation season, although it was interrupted by COVID. I think that he was still somebody who the hierarchy at Toulouse and the coaching staff trusted. Obviously, they haven't gone out and tried to replace him, but at the same time, he hasn't crumbled under that pressure. I think that what we've seen, obviously, because last season was a completely different picture for him. They were so poor in Ligue 1 last season, which isn't normal. Toulouse are normally a fairly consistent mid-table kind of League One outfit who do well in terms of player sales and player trading, but they were so poor from a defensive perspective that the pictures that he was seeing on the pitch last season are completely different to what he's seeing this season. Toulouse didn't have possession; they didn't have the ball to look for these moments when defenders could step forward or defenders could play the diagonal pass to access space on the far side of the pitch. He was just defending for his life for the vast majority of last season because they were under pressure almost constantly within matches. There were times where they would have possession, obviously, but then it becomes really difficult for a young player because your team are struggling, your team are behind, your team are losing the possession battle. So the moments when you do get the ball, being able to have the calmness to make the right choice and make the correct progressive pass becomes really difficult. I think this season, because yes, the quality in terms of their opponents is less, they perhaps got a little bit more time in terms of preparation, although the fixture list is still congested in League 2, sorry. I think that you're starting to see a different picture because this is a player who is more comfortable, perhaps, with a little bit more time in the ball when he's able to make correct choices, and he's not just purely seen as a defensive player. And that might be something that needs to be mirrored in his next move. He might need to move to a club who are willing to play a little bit more possession orientated instead of a club who are looking to just sit in a low block and then play quick transition football.
Yeah, that's certainly one of the considerations that I think any player who is sort of performing at the top level of a second division is going to need to take into account when the inevitable transfer speculation comes around from teams in the top flight. And just staying in France, though, moving on to sort of my first pick from second tier scouting, I've gone with Clermont Foot's Mohammed Bayo. Who's a 22-year-old striker, very much staying with the theme of picking strikers in these scouting episodes that we had last time around, Lee. But he's 6'2" tall. He's quite a presence on the pitch. And the first thing that I've got in my notes is that he's a knees up sprinter. Because it seems as though whenever he goes through on goal, his knees are almost touching his chest because he's just powering these legs to try and get onto the ball. He's got a huge cadence, a huge gait to get onto the ball. And sort of when he does latch onto it, unlike other players, typically more diminutive players, it's not as though he's cutting back onto a favoured foot and waiting for reinforcements. He's always sort of powering through. And I think it would be a mischaracterization to say that he is purely a player who is, someone who can play on the shoulder and go through on goal. That is true. He can play like that, but he also does have quite intelligent penalty box movement from what I've seen. He tends to arrive at the right time, doesn't break his stride, which I mean, I'm not comparing him to him, but it's the same sort of thing that Erling Haaland does that we see for Dortmund in that near post run at the left-hand side. When the ball is coming across from the left, he never seems to break stride. And that allows him to get a clean strike on the ball. It's almost like he just arrives right place, right time, and that's a hallmark of good strikers. And it's very similar in terms of Bayo's striking. He tends to to get on the end of cutbacks really well. And of course, there is the caveat that Ligue 2's defending isn't the best at most of the time, and there have been occasions this season, especially when he scored, where there've been balls played across, and there's nobody within 3 to 5 to 8 yards of him, and it's like, well, most top strikers are going to put those away. But in terms of being a striker, I think he's got around 30 goals in the past 2 seasons at Ligue 2 level. So at Championnat National, where he was out on loan last season. So there's scope to say that he's risen to the challenge in Ligue 2 this season with Clermont Foot. And I mean, top level, I think you may be pushing it in terms of his ceiling, his potential. But I do see some sort of similarities. It's actually quite funny because I see similarities between him and Famara Diédhiou, who is of Bristol City, who was also at Clermont Foot before getting moved to England. And I think the Championship is probably a league that Bayo would probably do quite well in. He's physical enough, but he's also smart enough to make that step up. And yeah, I wouldn't be surprised to see some interest from that sort of area, because he's a multifaceted striker, but has the physical tools to be able to mix it.
Yeah, definitely. I think that when you sent me across your message with your player picks, I responded saying that I'm convinced that Bayo scores about 20% of his goals by accident. Because when you watch him play, there is an awful lot of times the ball comes across and he makes contact somehow, but you're not quite sure sometimes how he's made contact and the ball ends up in the goal. But I think I first became aware of Bayo when he was playing on loan at Dunkirk in the lower tiers. I was doing some lower tier scouting using data, and Bayo's numbers just stood right out. So of course I went and had a look, and at first you're looking at him and you're going, I'm not convinced because it looks ungainly. You're right, with the knees right up, and he goes through on goal, and he's so single-minded. But then after a period of time, when a player, even at that level and then at second tier level, when they start to show the level of output that he does in terms of, I mean, to be honest, his goal involvements are goals per 90. They're not really assists per 90. He's not a false nine. He's not a creator. He probably makes more opportunities for teammates because opposition defenses are so scared of him that they cluster closer together towards him and then create space elsewhere. It's similar to the concept of gravity in basketball, when a really effective attacking player creates room by teammates just for being positioned in the penalty area. But when a player of this type starts to produce those kind of goal outputs, you have to pay attention, because one way or the another, he's scoring goals. And at the end of the day, if he's scoring a goal, who cares if it goes in off his shin, off his knee, or off a first-time half volley that he's timed really well? I think you're absolutely right that people, and myself included originally, I looked at him and saw a powerful runner, someone who took advantage of space behind opposition defensive lines, and the defending at the third tier was even worse than the second tier, so quite often he was just wandering about in spaces between the centre-backs and nobody was making a movement to get tight to him, so he was scoring a lot of goals. But then you look at him a little bit more closely, and it's those double movements in the penalty area. It's arriving at speed in the penalty area, but then adjusting the angle of his attack really quickly so that defenders don't know he's about to burst past him on the left or the right. And it's those little pieces of information that make him stand out in terms of his goal output. I think you're right. I think at the top level, we're not sure. He is somebody who I think would score goals in Liga to a point, because that profile of striker tends to do well in Liga. It's players who have that powerful running style. He's probably good for 10, 12, maybe even 14 goals in Liga next season if they go up. And that would be great for a club like Clermont Foot. But you have to wonder exactly where his level will come, where he'll level off, and where he'll come up against defences that will start to play him a little bit smarter, if you like, and not give him the space to run behind.
Yeah, very much so. Just as an aside, Clermont Foot are an interesting tale. They have never played in Liga, which, considering how they've been perennially a Ligue 2 side, it's quite hard to believe, but it's just never happened
Yeah.
for them. But yeah, this year they do appear to be on the cusp of sort of finally making it, and of course, partial credit must go to Bayo's goals. Whether they've come off his shin from a skewed half volley or that sort of thing. Um, Moving on into your second pick, Lee. Who are you going to go with for this one?
I think this time we'll go to the English Championship, and I really like Vitaly Janelt, the German number 6 that was signed this past year in October. He was signed by Brentford from VfL Bochum in the German second tier. Janelt is a self-confessed number 6. When he's asked about his best position, he always talks about being a 6, although he has played at times as an 8. He's a player that's had a really interesting, perhaps not very settled path to where he is just now, because he originally came through and was part of the Hamburg youth system. Then he was poached by RB Leipzig, who obviously really, really keen and are really strong in terms of their youth recruitment within Germany. They did quite well. They also signed Kimmich as well, away from Stuttgart as a young age, and developed him. Werner from Stuttgart as well. So from Leipzig, though, he then moved to VfL Bochum, and Bochum are such an interesting side for me because they play they're positioned in the same area as Schalke and Dortmund and all these big powerhouses in the Rhineland, and they still manage to attract really interesting players to their youth system, and they have a history and a quality in terms of how they give their young players minutes in the first team and they allow them to develop. But even then, he was never really settled at Bochum. And when Brentford came in for him, I think there was quite a lot of surprise in Germany that Brentford were interested in this player, not because anybody doubted his quality, but because he'd never really stamped himself in the Bochum first team. And suddenly you had a side who were aspiring for promotion to the Premier League in England that were willing to pay money to take him across to England. Um, he's done really well so far. I think there was an initial period where he was trying to acclimatise the English game. I think he was helped a little bit when Christian Norgard, the Danish international who plays as the 6 for Brentford most often, he had a bit of an injury, and he has had a few injuries during his Brentford career. And suddenly Janelt found himself in the first team, and I think he's impressed everybody since. He's combative, he's aggressive, he presses and tries to win the ball back quickly out of possession, but then he's got the ability to use the ball when he wins the ball in transition. He's not a 6 who just wants to win the ball and quickly give it away to a more creative player. He's quite happy to take the responsibility for being that creative player, being that progressive player, and he can break the lines with a pass. He can find all areas of the pitch with diagonal passes from his position. He's left footed, which I always find really interesting in a 6 because it opens up different areas of the field rather than somebody who is only right footed. And he's also shown a little bit of a goal threat, which is something I
Hmm.
don't think I'd seen in him before. He scored a screamer, I think it was against Middlesbrough, when he got the ball outside the area and just arrowed the ball into the far top corner. So certainly, I think somebody like Janelt, who's adding goals to his game as well as being that combative presence in the 6 role, I think is interesting for Brentford. And I remember when the transfer came through, I was reading up on it a little bit, and I came across an interesting article on the transfer market website, and they'd asked him about why he made the choice to go to Brentford, and he talked about a presentation that he was given by the club, by the head of football operations at the club, and they talked about Janelt's role, his strengths, his weaknesses, but they also talked about how many goal involvements they needed their number 6 to have in terms of the overall goal involvements for the game. Like, he would be responsible for X% of goal involvements if they got to their final target, and they believed this target would get them to promotion. So I think he really liked the level of detail, and that shows a player who's willing to think about the game. And he's also involved at the moment with the German under-21 squad at the European Championship we talked about earlier on. So he obviously is somebody who is still rated in his homeland too.
Well, Lee, it's fair to say I think you've just covered every single bullet point that I had on Janelle there. Typical defensive midfielder, number 6, but has a bit of a Brentford edge, is what I've written here, which I think is probably essentially what I was trying to articulate, in the sense that when you were saying that he's left-footed and has got a good distribution, good range from that number 6 role. But yeah, he's been playing well recently. I think it was Rasmus Ankersen, who's obviously high up at Brentford, who said that he expected a little bit of time for Janelt to adapt to English football, to adapt to the Championship. But yeah, as you said, with Christian Norgaard's injury, he's kind of been thrown into it, and by all accounts, he's done quite well. As you were saying about Bochum in Zwei Bundesliga, it's not as though they were on the same level as Brentford. It's not as if for the past 2 or 3 seasons they've been really angling for promotion and unfortunate to miss out like Brentford have been. So I think it's interesting to see that he's played 30 odd games this year, in probably the highest level that he ever has. And I think the Germany under-21 call up to the Euro squad is probably a reflection of that. In terms of just summarising Janelt, if you had to sum him up in 3 words, what would it be?
Combative, aggressive, intelligent.
Sounds like a number 6 to me. Absolutely, yeah. I mean, he's a nice player to watch. I think he does, as you say, he's combative and he's aggressive, but he does also have that a little bit of that creative spark without being sort of the star of the show, which I think probably is what Brentford identified in him. He's very functional. He's going to be that fulcrum at the base of your midfield, but he's going to be able to offer something as well. He's not one-dimensional. So, yeah, I think... Janelt, if Brentford come up, I'd very much like to see the faith be placed in him to maybe anchor that midfield. I'm not sure how it would transpire with him, playing at a higher level so soon. But you know what? He's adapted well to the Championship. Who's to say he couldn't do the same for the Premier League? Moving on, I suppose we'll stay with the German theme there. Not a defensive midfielder, although my last pick is a defensive midfielder. You can tell I was very conscious that I didn't want to pick all attacking players this time around. But it's a left back who's also in the Germany's under-21 Euro squad, who I've selected here. And it's David Raum, who is a 22-year-old left back who has 11 assists in the Zweite Bundesliga this season, which is a pretty standout figure. He's streets ahead of the competition in Germany, and he plays for Greuther Fürth, who sit 4th, I believe, with 3rd place going into a relegation/promotion playoff, with 16th in the Bundesliga, as that is how the promotion relegation system works in Germany's top 2 tiers. But the top 2, very much like the English Championship, go up automatically, and I think that it's very much still within the realms of possibility that Raum and Fürth could go up, but. I know what you're thinking. 11 assists in the league, 14 assists in all competitions from left back. You're like, right, okay. Surely he's got to be getting signed in the summer. Well, it's too late, isn't it, Lee? Because Hoffenheim have beaten everybody to it. He signed a pre-contract with the Bundesliga club in January until 2025. And a free transfer for a player with 14 assists who's just 22. It's pretty good business. He's pretty versatile. He can play in multiple setups in a 4-3-1-2, which is predominantly how Fürth play, but occasionally in a 5-3-2 as well, which shows that he has that attacking license. And given his history in Fürth's youth setup, he has typically played as a left winger or a right winger, and occasionally, a very long time ago, but occasionally he was played as a centre forward. So he does have that license to get forward, and he doesn't feel overawed or gets into nosebleed territory when he gets over the halfway line. But Lee, I'm sure that you've seen sort of a few of his assists, and his numbers especially will have stood out to you. But I decided to sort of go into the assists by sort of the category that they'd fall into. And there were 8 passes, 5 crosses, 2 crosses which led to the opposition scoring on goals, which I thought was quite interesting, that happened on more than one occasion. And there was 1 throw-in that have given him his 14 assists this season, or rather 14 assists and then 2 crosses which led to own goals. There's a nice variety there Although at times I feel as though the 8 passes, a few of those, well, more than a few, were sort of the final pass rather than an assist, if that makes sense. It was like the attacker then still has a lot to do, but it still gets credited as a Raum assist. I don't know if that's something that you observed with sort of your watching of him.
Yeah, I think the first thing is that I had no idea that you could get an assist from a throw-in. That was new information for me.
Well, he threw it was a throw in. He basically just passed it. It was a bog standard throw in at the touchline, obviously, and the first player sort of spins around and then hits one from range, and yeah,
That's amazing.
if you want to class that as an assist, I don't know. I mean,
Yeah, I would take it.
he does have a long throw in his locker, that must
Yeah.
be said, but that wasn't it. That wasn't the occasion. So when I saw it listed as a throw in on Transfermarkt, and then I went and looked at it, I went, oh well, I was kind of expecting a bit of Rory Delap, the German
Yeah.
edition, but no, it wasn't. It was pretty bog standard.
I think that's always the fun thing when you talk about assists. I mean, you're right. You talk about them, and clubs place such a high value on simple information such as goals and assists, which is fine, but they don't always translate to goals per 90 or assists per 90, and they don't always look at expected goals per 90 and expected assists per 90. And I think that there are levels of information below just assists that some clubs would probably benefit in looking at. But saying that, I think that you're absolutely right in what you say, that he is a really interesting player in the attacking phase for his side. Greuther Fürth, I think it would be amazing if they were to be promoted this season. I think they've maybe held on to Raum for a little bit too long, and that's why he's been allowed to leave in a free transfer to Hoffenheim, because obviously he refused to sign a new contract and said he was leaving. Perhaps the club could have sold him 12 months earlier, but on the flip side, if they sold him, they might not currently be in a promotion fight. So, as a fan of the club, surely you would take the potential promotion with the fact that the player might leave in a free transfer. I think he's really interesting in that he does play in slightly different positions. He's very smart from left back and knowing when to be wide to provide width and when to come inside a little bit. And it's when he comes inside in those half spaces, as modern fullbacks tend to, it's when he comes in there that you see him making those passes that quite often end in goal opportunities or chance creation, because he's got the ability to find the feet of the striker. He doesn't mind trying to find the furthest line with a pass from those half spaces, as opposed to just looking to keep the ball moving from left to right, if you like, to try and keep pressure up. He's quite happy to be aggressive in possession, I think, is probably a good way to look at it. But he does have good vision in terms of when he does get up around the outside, because he is comfortable as a left winger as well as a left back, and obviously as a left wing back. So he's somebody that Hoffenheim, who quite often switch formation in games, and from game to game, he's somebody who will be quite good for them. But he's capable of getting around the outside and making those connections. And you're right, it's interesting that two of his crosses have ended up in own goals, because that obviously suggests that he's putting the ball into areas of the box that are extremely dangerous, and that defenders have to try to defend aggressively when they're out of control, which obviously ends up in the own goal. It's completely the right time now for him to make the step up, and I think it's really interesting that he's chosen Hoffenheim to do that, because from a developmental level, for a 22-year-old to go to Hoffenheim, you could see him play there for 2 years and then move on to a Champions League caliber German club if he keeps up this kind of output.
Yeah, certainly that is one of the trajectories that I think we could definitely see Raum on, and quite fittingly, in Germany's opening under-21 Euros game against Hungary, he did in fact get an assist. So very much staying with the theme. So I think that must be 15 assists all competitions, club and country, for him this season. Which I know we're getting sort of caught up on it, but I mean it is a very standout figure. And I mean, I know I said the caveat about a lot of his past assists are sort of final passes, but there are one thing I will say about a few of them is that they are creative. They're often incisive passes. It's him getting into areas which your traditional left back, one who's perhaps less comfortable playing wider, less comfortable going around the outside, just simply wouldn't take up those spaces. And yeah, completely agree with what you're saying about the own goals that have arisen from Raum crosses, because if you put the ball into the corridor of uncertainty, then you've got defenders there who are thinking, right, I need to get rid of this because there's a striker on my shoulder, and it forces them into making a decision. And not all of the time it pays off for the defence, as we've seen this season with Greuther Fürth. Just moving on, Lee. I'm just going to go with who's your third pick.
My third pick is the one that you got most excited about when I sent my list across. So
Yes, of course it is. Yes,
be on to
I remember now.
So we're going to Serie B in Italy, and it's Samuel Ricci, the 19-year-old central midfielder at Empoli. He's such a lovely player, and I've always had a soft spot for Empoli. My wife and I have been to Florence quite a few times, and yes, I've been to Fiorentina game, but I've also been to a couple of Empoli games, and I love the club and the stadium and kind of the edginess around the club a little bit. And again, like so many of the clubs that we're talking about, Empoli have got a real habit of developing these young players. Is Mel Benazir, who's now at Milan, obviously played at Empoli, amongst others, and they seem to love these technical central midfielders. He's somebody who has been capped by the Italy under-21 squad. He's not in the European Championships, much to my dismay when I saw the squad, because I think he would really add something to the Italy side that I saw play yesterday. And obviously, they've now got a bit of an issue with Tonali having been sent off in that match and being suspended for a period of time. But Ricci is capable of playing as a 6 or an 8. He is so alike a lot of young Italian players. You see, when you watch Italy play at the national level, at the European Championships, the World Under-20 Cup, the Olympics, whatever underage competition it is, they're always full of players who are tactically and technically extremely well coached. So they're all comfortable receiving the ball, they're all capable of slotting and rotating in and out of different positions, they're all capable of finding the next right pass, if you like. They don't always have that level of creativity and ingeniousness, if you like, that sometimes teams need to have. They miss a little bit of the creative flair, if you like, and that's why players that come through Italy like Lorenzo Insigne, for example, that's why they're so important to the Italian national side. And Ricci has a little bit of that creativity in him. He's extremely capable around the final third and finding little angles and pockets to receive the ball. He plays intelligent passes. He's capable of breaking the defensive line with a pass. He quite likes the no-look pass to the player coming round his blind side, which I always like to see in young players, that little bit of creativity and willingness to take a chance. But he's also quite combative. He's not somebody who gets pushed off the ball easily. He likes to stand his ground in midfield. He's capable of making a challenge. He's capable of pushing defenders off the ball to win the ball back, and he presses and chases the ball really well out of possession. I think I've already seen links to bigger clubs in Serie A. Fiorentina have been linked for quite a while, and that's quite normal for youngsters from Empoli, because for those that don't know, Empoli is a small city on the outskirts of Florence, so it's not difficult for Fiorentina to get scouts out, and they'll know all the players in the Empoli youth system anyway. But he was also quite strongly linked to Milan before they signed Sandro Tonali, and I read a couple of articles saying that if Tonali falls through for any reason, then Ricci would be the correct choice, because he's a young midfielder who has the qualities that Milan were looking for. I know, Joe, that you're a fan of him. What do you make of him?
Yeah, Ricci is. I mean, I'm disappointed that he won't be at the under-21 Euros, because there's been an outbreak of COVID cases at Empoli, so that's kind of ruled him out there. It's not as though he wouldn't be getting called up, and to be honest, I don't think it would be too long if he were playing at this level in Serie A, continuing, the same consistent level of performance. I wouldn't say it would be too long until he was sort of in the discussion for the senior team. But I just think he's a fantastic player in that, he's typically a central midfielder, but very much plays on the left side of this very Italian 4-3-1-2 within the three. And he's very, very comfortable, very adept at taking up those wide spaces with his back to the touchline. As with the no-look passes, as you said, he just has, he just it seems to ooze confidence a bit, and I very much like that style of footballer who is versatile enough that they can play in multiple positions within a system, because it means that you're so tactically flexible. Having a player who isn't regimented, who isn't, going to be completely ineffectual if you ask them to actually migrate into spaces elsewhere on the pitch. is so useful for teams, because you can it's very much the same in players who are central midfielders who can drop into the fullback space, um, who are very comfortable. When their wing backs push on, that central midfielders drop into those right hand and left hand half spaces, sort of in the around the centre circle. I think Ricci is sort of the inverse of that, in that he's not dropping into the left back space; he's sort of pushing up into the left midfielder's left wing space, which I very much like. And to be fair, when I was watching Empoli, when I was watching Ricci before this, one thing I did want to get from sort of your insight was the dynamics of how that works. How does that formation? How does a player of that ilk? How does it? What are the dynamics of a 4-3-1-2 with a player like that, like Ricci in this team?
I think that in the 4-3-1-2, you're right, the wide midfielders, they kind of have to be multifunctional, because you have the 10, you have the two strikers, and they're kind of the fixed positions within the team. And beyond that, you'll have the central midfielder in the 3, who will act more as the 6 and won't really move very far. So you have two pivots, and that you have the central midfielder in the 3, and you have the 10. So they kind of stay central, and they kind of always act, and the rest of the players move around them. So to play in the wide areas and the wide midfield in the 4-3-1-2, it's narrow when you look at it in the pitch, because he is a central midfielder, not a left-sided winger. But there is an emphasis on the players in those areas being able to move forward into half spaces, especially, and kind of combine with the fullback as they move forward, because the fullback moves forward to provide the width, and the left-sided central midfielder has to be the one in the half space to provide the connection between that and the 10 and the striker. But if the fullback doesn't get forward quickly enough, or is in transition, you'll find the left-sided central midfielder, so Ricci for Empoli, he will move outside to collect the ball wide, and then he'll either hold the ball up, play combination play, and then gradually move back inside as the fullback catches that play. So I think it goes down again to what I talked about with young players in the Italian setup, that they're so well coached from a tactical perspective, that they're taught system of play. They're taught that from a very young age, and they play in different formations. They play in diamonds. They play in 4-4-2s and 4-3-2s and 3-5-2s and all these different things. And players are taught what pictures to look for in terms of where they should be on the pitch at any given time. And when you see a player break through that has that tactical versatility, it becomes really interesting, because he combines that with the technical ability, that you're right, he can receive the ball on the touchline at times and then play combinations to allow the attack to catch up. He can play further forward in the half space and affect the game from there. But defensively, he also knows exactly what his position is in the 4-3-1-2. So it becomes more narrow then, and the fullback's kind of isolated against the opposition winger, and the left-sided central midfielder will come across as the opposition fullback, then looks to join in to try to overload. But otherwise, he will stay centrally and try to break passing lanes for the opposition. So there's a lot going on for players in that position, and it is typically Italian, because you don't see it used in a lot of different places, a lot of other countries. But at the same time, I think that the Italian game is almost one of the most dynamic and flexible from a tactical perspective. You can watch a slate of Italian games if you want to the weekend, and you'll see 3-5-2, 4-3-3, 4-4-2, 4-3-1-2. You'll see diamonds with different configurations, and that's what makes the Italian game so interesting for me. So I think that's probably quite part of the reason that Ricci is somebody who has been looked at so closely, I think, by Serie A sides. I don't think he's somebody who's likely to move abroad. You don't often see young Italian players of this mould moving to foreign countries. They kind of tend to stay in Italy. It's more likely that he will move to a bigger club. I would really like personally to see him at an Atalanta, where I think his technical ability in the midfield would be really important.
It's very, very, very interesting that you mentioned Atalanta right at the end there, because throughout that, the image that it was evoking in my head was just the success of Atalanta has been just this positional and tactical flexibility, and the tactical intelligence that all of these, middle of the road players at Atalanta, because let's face it, that's what they had been for the vast majority of their
Yeah.
career before they were corralled into Giampiero Gasparini's system. Very middle of the road players, just the tactical intelligence that they all play. They all fill in each other's positions when they're out of when they go forward with the ball, in and out of possession. It's like it's regimented, but it's regimented in fluidity, in the sense that they know the role. essentially football is a game of patterns. They know where to be and how to position themselves when certain patterns show themselves. And I think that is exactly what you're saying on the sense that, young Italian players are coached in the sort of in tactical speak, so to speak, because they very much know how to adapt themselves to different tactical situations. And Ricci, certainly in Serie B, is kind of one of the perfect examples of that. Just moving on to our last pick, and it is my last player. And out of the three that I've picked, I think Mohammed Bayo was probably quite raw. David Raum was is probably a bit more refined than the other two. But Samu Costa, who is with Almeria at the moment in the Spanish Segunda, so the division below La Liga, he is the player that I think is perhaps the most raw at the moment. He's a 20-year-old number 6 on loan at Almeria from SC Braga in Portugal, and there's an option to buy there. But Almeria are sort of on the cusp of trying to be promoted from La Liga to behind Real Mallorca, who look like at the face of things look like they'll probably take the title. But the thing that stuck out for me with Samu Costa was that he's a very jagged player. He's very deliberate with his movements, and for a player who's so young, playing at a reasonably high level, his physicality stands out on the pitch, which is always a good indicator of how ready and how adept a player is for men's football. Essentially, he's 20 years old. And is no stranger. He's not shy of putting himself about. He's intelligent in the way that he's very good at drawing fouls as well. Leans his body in to draw the decision from the referee, which, if nothing else, is actually quite smart. It relieves pressure on your team, can waste a bit of time. But as I was saying, he seems to be a bit rough around the edges. I feel like his passing could probably be improved. We were talking about sixes earlier who can play those long rangey passes, centre backs who can make those line breaking balls. I'd say with Samu Costa, that's not an area of his game that's quite developed yet. He's a very good player to have in a team who dominate possession, because he's very good at keeping the tempo. He's constantly on the move. It's almost like he's never sprinting because he's always there, ready to receive, ready to be that fulcrum type player, where you can bounce passes into and he'll bounce them back out to other players, and it just helps you. It's just another route to sort of progressing the ball. But yeah, in terms of his ball progression, there are certainly limitations to it, as well as keeping composure under pressure. Sometimes his passes can be a bit rushed, but in terms of tidying up in front of Almeria's defence, then I think his attributes are very impressive, and I think particularly in a more defensive, more destructive top flight team, I don't think he's top level potential, but I think he has La Liga potential, at the very least Liga NOS potential. I think his defensive attributes in particular could certainly translate to that higher level. Lee, I don't know what you sort of gleaned from any insights that you saw from watching Samu Costa, if you managed to get round to that at all.
I think this is a first for this podcast when we've been doing these, but you've caught me. This is a player that I wasn't aware of before you sent him over. Doesn't happen very often. I quite often find myself scrolling through Scout and then using data obviously to find interested players, and Samu Costa hadn't ended up on my radar at all. So when you sent over your list, I went and watched his touches for 4 or 5 games, and I've kind of done a little bit of research, and I think what you're saying is really interesting, because for as much as we talked with Vitali Janelt about his ability to break the lines as a 6 and how that can be important for a team, the truth with football is that not all number 6s are made the same. Not all number 6s are required to be the same player. You don't have to have a number 6 who's able to break the line. And I think that Samu Costa, to put it mildly, he's got a bit of a bastard about him.
Yeah.
He doesn't mind. I mean, you're absolutely right. He doesn't mind winning fouls. And if you remember the dominant Man City team, the 100-point season, there was so much criticism levelled from opposition supporters, especially at Fernandinho, because he had this habit of either giving away professional fouls when the opposition were in transition, or winning professional fouls when the opposition would just seem to make the lightest of contact. But the way he fell and gesticulated at the referee always seemed to be a free kick for Man City. I think Samu Costa's got a little bit of that about him. He's somebody who will wind up opposition players and fans. I think there's value in having a number six who is that support behind the ball and is that constant reference. It's similar to when Liverpool won the title last season. There was a lot of talk about Fabinho because Pep Linders, the Jurgen Klopp's assistant, came out in the media and said that Fabinho is our lighthouse. That meant that he was the reference point for the team. He was a player who would always be positioned in supporting areas. He'd always be positioned centrally, and the rest of the team knew they could move around him. And Samu Costa has a little bit of that. He's not the same player. I'm not saying that he's Fabinho, and I'm not saying he's Fernandinho. These are just comparisons that I make because there are little things that remind me about the player. But for Samu Costa, I think that he is always there to be the receiver and then bounce the ball back out of pressure to move the impact and the focus and the angle of the attack from one side or one half space to the other half space. And that can be important for the team. I really like Braga in Portugal in terms of the way, again, we keep coming back to this, and we could probably do a whole podcast on teams that we find interesting in terms of their player development and youth development. And Braga's another one. They've got this ability to develop players who aren't just technically good, but they're mentally strong as well. They have that ability to take challenges, and Braga have got a reputation as the underdogs, obviously, in Portugal, behind Sporting and Porto and Benfica. So Braga players have to be a little bit more functional, a little bit more aggressive, and they have to be bastards sometimes. And I think that Samu Costa has that. I think Almeida in themselves are interesting because obviously last season, everybody, well, not everybody, but a lot of us were watching Almeida because they had Darwin Núñez, who obviously then made the move to Benfica. And I think that Samu Costa has been an interesting player. I think he's somebody who I have now got on shortlists and I've got on spreadsheets and I'm going to be keeping an eye on. I think it's likely that Almeida will take up the option to buy if they get promoted. If they don't get promoted, I think it's a little bit more tenuous in terms of their financial situation and whether they would or not. But if he does go back to Braga, he is somebody who could well take the opportunity to start there in Liga NOS.
I mean, that's a huge endorsement for my talent ID there. That you've now entered him into your the infamous spreadsheets. But no, I agree what you're saying. You know, he does have a bit of the bastard about him, and it's one of those things that we keep coming back to. That sometimes you do need in young players. You need a bit of needle because otherwise you're gonna get eaten alive. And you know, he's very good aerially. You know, he's quite tall. He's 6'1", 6'2", and yeah, he's very developed. And what you were saying about sort of not all number sixes are made differently, are not made the same. You know, what I've described him as in my notes is that he's a smuggler. You know, there are many ways to progress the ball up the pitch. He smuggles it. You know, defenders, the midfielders, they funnel the passes into him, a 1-2 through Costa, and you know, you're 10 yards closer to the opponent's goal. It doesn't have to be a straight line breaking pass. It doesn't have to be a progressive carry. You know, it can just be sometimes you're just that touch point that your team can rely on, like the lighthouse as you were referencing. But yeah, I think he's certainly a player that I'm going to be a little bit invested in now. I think because he has a bit of that needle,
Yeah.
I'm probably a little bit more invested in him than any of the other players that we've mentioned, and that's probably why I've left him to last so I can wax lyrical the most. But yeah, say Almeria go up and exercise their option. There'll certainly be occasions where I think in La Liga he may be found out in quotes, but I think he's the type of player where from watching him, as you say, for 4 or 5 games, you know, that it'll probably be a great learning experience, and he probably will pick up so much in the way of, you know, just tactical nous in terms of knowing when to draw certain fouls, knowing when to alleviate pressure on your team, and when to hone those defensive actions. So yeah, I think he's definitely a player that I'm gonna keep an eye on for is Samu Costa. That brings us to the end of our second tier scouting episode. We've gone through 6 players there: Mohammed Bayo, David Raum, Samu Costa, Vitali Janelt, Bafodi Diakite, and Samuele Ricci. They predominantly play for teams who are challenging for promotion this season, but I think it's fair to say that across Europe's top 5 leagues and the divisions below them in those countries, those second tiers are stocked full of talent. Very much like the same story in the Championship. There is a vast array of talented players who regularly make the step up to the Premier League. The same can be said of Zweite Bundesliga, Serie B, Ligue and La Liga too. So certainly, if you're at a loose end and you're looking to pick up a little bit more football, perhaps more niche viewing, then I'd say that the second tiers is definitely the place to be. Lee, thank you very much again for joining me on this one. I'm sure we'll have another episode, perhaps even SC Braga and their talent ID and development in future. But thank you very much for coming on again.
No worries, thank you for having me. I enjoyed it.
Absolutely. Well, that is all from us. Keep an eye out on the Scouted Football Twitter and Instagram and our social accounts for everything to do with under 21 Euro, as that will be happening this week. If you would like to see more in-depth scouting and analysis and opinion, do check out the Scouted Football website or pick up a handbook that you can get on sfhandbook.com. But failing that, if you just like listening to these pods, thank you very much for tuning in. This has been the Scouted Football Podcast. Bye for now.